Hello, it sounds like we're live here. I was waiting for Rebecca, our host, to come in and say a few words about Femme and CherryPicks, how they set up this panel. But it seems like we're jumping straight into this. I'm Tasha Robinson. I'm the film and TV editor at Polygon.com. I have been a film critic since 1990, since college, so a long time in this business, and I have seen it change a lot over the years, especially over the last year. So we're bringing in a panel of film critics who have also been in the industry for varying periods of time, for a lot of different publications, who have also seen a lot of changes happen over the years. We're going to bring them up one at a time so they can introduce themselves, talk about where they write, talk about how long they've been doing this. Rebecca, you want to drop in our first guest?
Hi, everyone. My name is Aramide Tinubu. I've been writing film criticism for about 7 years now, since graduating from graduate school. I work at a variety of different publications, including Showbiz Cheat Sheet, Indiewire, Shadow and Act, Essence, and you can pretty much catch all of my work at awordwitharamide.com.
Excellent. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, my bad. Hi, everybody. My name is Kathia Woods. I have been a film critic for about 4 years. I wrote about music for about 15 years prior to that. I have my own site called cupofsoulshow.com, but I've also written for the Playlist, Awards Watch, BuzzFeed, and recently Emmys.com.
Hi, I'm Inkoo Kang. I am currently at The Hollywood Reporter. Before that, I was at Slate. Before that, I was at MTV News. I think I already said I have been doing this for about 10 years, so I will let the next person go.
Hi, I'm Claudia Puig. I'm currently on Film Week, which is a podcast and also public radio station. Before that, I was a film critic at USA Today for like 17 years. And then I was a reporter before that at the LA Times. In between, I've done some work for The Wrap, for AARP, for NPR, All Things Considered. And I've been doing this for about 20 years.
So that is a lot of years for everybody put together, and a lot of different experience with a lot of different publications, including that self-published, going straight to the readers, which is something that wasn't an option when I started in this gig. It's been a really interesting period of change, but I think more so than ever over the last year. So sort of spoilers for how this panel is going to go. I sent kind of a list of questions to the moderators, and they just turned it into the description for this event. So you may see some familiar questions come up here. Just to start with, how has this job changed for everybody in the pandemic over the last year? Whether it's necessarily pandemic related or not, how much have you seen what you're covering, or why you're covering it, what you're drawn to change just over the last year? Feel free to just jump in. This is going to be a freewheeling conversation.
I mean, here's the thing. Our country is at a reckoning right now. And with the racial injustice last year, and this has been a wonderful year for Black film. We have gotten more variety than we've had in a very, very long time, and different voices, and especially from Black women of different ages. So it's been good. I've had a really good pandemic, knock on wood. And I've been in demand, so to say. It's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing, because on the one hand, I'm like, yes, I'm a Black woman. Yes, I'm Latina. Yes, I'm a woman over 40 and a mom and all those other things. But I don't just have interest to talk about Black things or Latinx things. I'm a citizen of the world. I speak several languages. I've lived in different places. I have various perspectives on different things. So the one thing, the area that I'm still kind of like being hindered on, and that's why it's nice to have my own site, because I have the freedom then to talk about it in my space, is to have the gift to be able to write about things that aren't necessarily just about being Black and being a woman.
I think there's also been a great deal of accessibility. So going to what Kathia just said, being able to screen films, though it's not the same as going to these really beautiful theaters here in New York City where I am, there's just been a lot of accessibility. Would I recommend doing Sundance or New York Film Festival in front of a computer? Maybe not necessarily ever again, but it has really allowed you and afforded you the opportunity to watch a lot more projects without sort of that adjusting to the West Coast time, without being, well, it's exhausting still, but it's a different type of exhaustion because you can kind of stand up, stretch, and dive right back into a new film. That's been a really cool experience, I think, allowing more people to see these films.
Yeah, I agree. I wear a few different hats, and one of them is a film festival programmer. So I was senior programmer for AFI Fest this year, and it was interesting to see because I've been involved in smaller, like little local film festivals in California and North Carolina, and in terms of curation is so similar. It's kind of a connection of being a critic. So it's been a really great experience. One of the things I found from doing a virtual film festival was that, yes, you could reach a wider group of people. Before, you had to have people fly into Los Angeles. Sometimes that's not convenient. That's not a possibility for people financially. So that was great. So you could get people from all over the country. And when we did the Q&As with filmmakers, we got 100% participation. I remember one day I was talking to someone from Nigeria in the morning and someone from Argentina in the afternoon. It was just, it was really great. So it's kind of been a leveler in many ways so that everyone has access. Frankly, it doesn't hold a candle to being able to go to a film festival in person and, all of that, the conversations that you have with people. So I really miss that, of course. But there have been some advantages. And on the flip side, as a critic, watching things, I kind of broke down and got a bigger screen because I had like a really small screen. And I thought this, I'm just doing a disservice to movies like Nomadland or, something that's like deserves to be seen on a big screen. I feel like I've never watched as many movies as I've watched this year, which is weird because when we all started the pandemic, you kind of thought, oh, there's not going to be any movies. We're going to run out, which has not been the case. I feel like it's been a great time for independent films because some of the ones that were maybe the next tier down that might not have gotten distribution suddenly have distribution, whether it was through a very small streaming service or whatever. You could see more. So you had the opportunity for greater diversity. And I agree with Kathia that, as a Latina, there have been some fantastic films from Latin America this year. There have been some great films. African-American filmmakers have made great films. There have been great films from Asia. So there's been a little bit more of the diversity that we are so lacking in this industry. So those are some pluses.
I don't think I have anything to add. You guys really covered the gamut.
Well, let's start with you on this one, Inkoo. It seems like when I first got into this business, almost all film critics were male. It was really rare that I would be in a screening room with other women. And then we kind of went through a period where more women were coming into the field. But the kind of thing that Kathia is talking about in terms of only being asked to cover Black subjects, I saw a lot of that as a woman. Like, we need a woman to review this film about women. And nothing else. There was an assumption that women didn't care for genre films, that women didn't care for action films, that women didn't care for dramas about men, which was like 90% of movies. Have you all seen that changing in the field? Like, do you feel like you have more freedom now to cover a wider range of films about a wider range of people, rather than being kind of shoved into that box of only certain kinds of women films?
I don't really feel like I've ever been quite that level of pigeonholed. I did used to do something like 2 or 3 movie reviews a week at the Wrap for a couple of years. I forgot to mention that. And I think in that time, I had a really great editor, Alonzo Giraldi, who was very good about distributing the amount of stuff that I got. So sometimes if it was sort of like a very like female-centric thing, he would offer to me. But I also got lots of like Jesus films and stupid action movies and whatever else. And so I don't personally feel pigeonholed in that way, although I definitely recognize that that is a thing for a lot of people. I think maybe one thing to note is that it wasn't just this dearth of female critics when I started. It also seemed very much like a dearth of female protagonists in movies, as you mentioned. And I think that even though the statistics are still extremely heavily skewed toward men, there's been a lot of movement for more female protagonists, sometimes in good ways, sometimes in like not so good ways. I think Tasha actually wrote this like amazing article about how there's been a bunch of female characters who are basically male characters, but like basically like played by an actress with like no actual like female qualities. I think it's called something like strong female characters or I know like it has like the title, and I feel like that was like a really good, really crystallizing piece that talked about like how we still don't really have a full representation in that a lot of these roles in action movies or a lot of these roles in other typically male-oriented genres, like they don't really have like maybe like a female experience in them still. But I do think that because the industry is more aware of that representational lack, they've been making some movement toward them. And so like, am I really thrilled that there is like a new version of like Charlie's Angels with like a lead-in message directed by like a woman director? Like on the one hand, like sure, like I'm glad like that sort of exists for women. Did I particularly enjoy that movie? No. And so I think it's one of those things where we're still very much in this process of increasing representation. And I think, you know, numerically we're making progress. I think we can, I think the larger question of like creatively, are we getting like real substantial representation? That's a much larger question.
I agree. And I think sometimes it's not necessarily our editors or the people that we answer to that will pigeonholes, but sometimes it's publicists. Because I'll hear from people like, I'm a woman over 50. They're not, you know, apparently there's not enough of us doing film criticism. So like they'll say, oh, you know, we'd like you to come see Palms, the stupid movie about cheerleaders who are 1,000 years old. It's like, no, just because I'm, you know, in that sort of demographic, no. And so those are the people sometimes I feel like I get pigeonholed by, or like, oh, you're Latina, you'll like this or something. So that happens maybe more than even the outlet. On the other hand, I will say that sometimes I'll work, you know, when I do stuff for KPCC, like there'll be a small Latino movie and like it just won't be covered. And so I'll be like, no, we have to cover this, you know? So sometimes I'm the one pigeonholing myself, I guess, but it's not, I don't consider it pigeonholing. I consider it like, you know, represent. It's just, you know, you're there advocating for people to see something that might get overlooked by, you know, sort of white male dominant culture.
The thing that Inkoo was specifically talking about seeing perspectives that feel more like they were written by women, that feel more like they're taking women into consideration. I'm curious for other people to kind of take up that theme. Are there things that you're particularly excited about having seen, like changing in cinema, things that are coming into cinema now as a result of kind of the new diversity of writers, of more women directing, more women scripting, more women producing?
Certainly. I think if you look at something like Zola, which I saw, I don't even know, I think Sundance a year ago at this point, I love seeing things like that because not only is it gorgeously stylized and, you know, it's about a Twitter story and it's, you know, I'm not sure who the screenwriter is, but I know the director is a woman, and you see these nuances. So it's not, as Kathia was explaining, like this, like trauma porn that you have to go see as a Black woman, like, oh, like, let's go watch like another Black woman be downtrodden and sexually abused. Like, I don't want to see that. I don't want to watch another Black Lives Matter movie, like, where someone gets shot and killed. And it's just a cycle in a cycle. But my friends, like, I'm in my 30s, like, we're still young and sexy, and I want to see that. We finally have a credit card that works. We want to see, we're at that level. So you want to see the lavishness. And I think even when you look at something like a Bridgerton, which isn't film, but TV, you get to see yourself in these really lavish, like, period pieces, or even something that, I can't think of the director's name, Little Women, when that came out. I thought that was just so richly done and very different. Yes, it's very different than the versions that we'd seen previously. So I think women add a really beautiful texture to films, especially when we're not just retelling the same old, like, Charlie's Angels. Like, how many times are we going to talk about Charlie's Angels, or how many times are we going to see the same kind of like buddy comedies? Like the men have done it and it's dry. Like, let's like spice it up a bit. Like, I don't really want to see Ocean's 585. Like, there's so many beautiful ideas. And I think when we allow women and people of color to tell their authentic stories, and we're not just trying to double down on what we know has made money in the past, that's when I can say, like, oh yeah, this is a Black thing, but I'm ready to talk about it, versus like, oh, like, you Black girl, like, you can write about this thing, when it's kind of like, I can, but like, I can also write about the royals and sci-fi as well. So
I think what Aramide said was so spot on. Like, I saw Bridgerton and I was like, finally, Black people in period pieces, and we're not the slaves or the help. We are people that are rich and we're lavish, and we are like uber lavish, you know what I mean? And I'm in my 50s too, and I'm like, we have not had a Dominic Devereaux. I grew up with my grandmother watching Dynasty and Dallas, and I'm like, how is it? I'm a 70s kid, and I'm like, we've had more interesting women characters in some aspects on television and in certain parts of films in the 70s than we are having now, and we're supposedly more progressive. If you look at Policewoman, which was really, interesting for that piece, and I love police detective shows. And the other thing too is, I'm like, one of my favorite films was Miss Juneteenth. That movie spoke to me. It was my favorite film of last year as a mother, as a Black woman. I love that she took her story, her reality of growing up in Texas in this small town, and saying, these are the people that I know. I want to show you my community through my eye. And I think what made that movie work is you didn't have to be Black. You didn't have to be a mom in order for you to get it. The themes are universal. They were just happened to be told by a Black woman via this lens. And that's what I love writing about. It's about saying, you know what, give us an opportunity to say where we're from. Like, we can be all women, but that doesn't mean our experience is necessarily the same. We can all be the same age. That doesn't mean we want cookie cutter. What I want to is, as a moviegoer, and I adore movies, it's one of the gifts my mom gave me, is to be in a space and to be transformed and to learn about other people. I think movies, a little bit like food, you learn a lot about who people are by the type of stories that they tell. And the beauty of this year is with these small films getting an opportunity to rise to the top, because everybody was hoping that we all go back to the theater. So people were like, okay, I'll give you this one. I'll give you this one. I'll give you this one. Now realizing that they're sitting on these gems. And guess what? We started paying attention, and we were like, wait a minute, this is some good stuff. This is better than some of the other stuff So I'm hoping, as we get back to normal, whatever that will look like, that we don't shove these movies in the back anymore, that we spend serious marketing and money, not just during award season, but understand there is an audience out there that doesn't want to see the DC, the MCU, that doesn't want to see Fast and the Furious 800, but they want to come to the movie theater and they want to be transported. And maybe that means, you only release it in 3 screens at the multiplex. But stop thinking the audience, especially as women, that they're not intelligent, or that they're not engaging, or they're not willing to give their money. We go in packs, right? Wherever we go, we're going to have lunch. We're going to have 2 or 3 of us are going to come see this. So why would you not want to invest in these movies?
So
yeah.
I think.
Oh, I was just going to say, I want to co-sign what they said, because I think it's all about authentic stories. I think that is the key, and men can make authentic stories too. But, and we're talking about women's authentic stories. Yeah. Why should we see, and I understand why women do it. It's, it's a way to, if you're offered a chance to do this big tentpole blockbuster, of course, you're going to do that. But, I'd like to see what, for instance, I just saw this film called Test Pattern that I thought was fantastic. And, little independent film that could have been lost, if not for maybe the pandemic helped to find this film. It's a story I hadn't seen before. I want to see stories I haven't seen before, or, just something that I always said, things that make you kind of sit up a little taller in your seat and you're kind of excited. You don't know where it's going. that's what I want to see.
I feel like that's something that's pretty universal to film critics. And to the degree that film critics often get dinged for being out of step with the public, it's often, I think, because we see so many movies, we're always hungry for the new. We're always hungry to see something we haven't seen before, maybe to a degree that the widespread public isn't. And one of the best things we can do about critics, one of the best things we can do as critics is kind of push people towards all of these gems that we love. One of the best things we can do as women, I think, is push people to stories by and about women, stories for women, stories that, as you're saying, are kind of like for us and our friends, our girls when we're out. I'm curious for everybody here if you see there being other specific things that women specifically as film critics can bring to the conversation, that whether it's like a responsibility or an opportunity.
I would say, so two of the most sort of films that I think about from last year is The 40-Year-Old Virgin and then Promising Young Woman. And I remember distinctly, well, I think The 40-Year-Old Virgin is a perfect film, but Promising Young Woman is a perfect film for me until the end. And I remember I had such a visceral reaction to it because I hated the way that film ended. And I was surrounded by men in the screening and they were all like, oh yes. And mind you, this is a film written and directed by a woman. Beautifully told. I just hated the way that it ended. And I feel like as a woman to have such a visceral reaction to the end when so many people are like, oh, this is like the best thing I've ever seen. Why was that? And I had to dig up what I experienced in the world navigating a really scary world as a woman and why I felt like that ending for me and for women was such a disservice and a letdown. So I think that's the different experience that we bring to it. And I think it was an excellent Emerald is an excellent filmmaker, and she did a really cool thing with that story. But I think it brings in this conversation. We're not just getting this blanket like, oh, this was an amazing film, when it was like, yeah, until that ending. So I think that's what women bring. We bring our own experience because we do have to be concerned about our safety and be concerned about, misogynoir and misogyny and sexism and all these different layers and things. So we see things a little bit different, that it's not from that same lens that men often do.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think it's really good to sort of question those reactions. I remember when I was at Telluride last year and I saw Ford versus Ferrari, which of course is not a movie made by a woman, has no women in it except the wife. And I hated that movie. I just felt like it made me angry. It was all white men. And I realized that, this was kind of based on a real story. It involved white men, but I just felt like, I don't need to see this movie. I don't like this movie. There's no reason for this. And I kept talking to everybody was just loving it. Men didn't even notice that there were no women. And the few women that I know that liked it went, yeah, but there was that wife character. And I'm like, oh, all she did was drive really fast. Okay, that was like not showing anything. And it just made me so angry. And I realized there were just a couple other people that I kind of connected with who had that same feeling. But some people just don't even notice those things. And it's frustrating when you do. And then you want to sort of analyze, well, what kind of a button did this push for me? And it's worth analyzing that.
Inga?
I mean, obviously women as a whole don't exist as like a monolith. I think like it's pretty obvious. Like I don't actually need to say that. But I think that in a lot of ways there are no substitutes for lived experience. And I think before you were talking previously about how as film critics we're always craving the new, we're always craving for something different. And if you are a woman who is watching a story about another woman or women in the plural, I think it's easier to note a lot of the time like what actually does feel new or what actually feels really hackneyed. I think I always come back to this example, but I just remember watching the first Wonder Woman movie and really like tearing up at like the action scenes when like it's in the first act of the movie and they're on that like Greek island or whatever, and not really understanding like why this action sequence was like making me tear up. And then after I went home, I went online and there was like already chatter about like why those scenes were so powerful. And so much of it had to do with the fact that when we see athletic women on film, we never see them with like athletic women's bodies, because they're usually like these like very actressy looking bodies, and that look like they have like sort of like I don't know, like muscle lines as sort of like an accessory as opposed to something like much more functional. And it's just like that type of thing where I think I like went to go see that movie with my husband, and he was like, "Oh yeah, like that was really cool. Like women are strong or whatever." But I was like, "No, the point of this is that like I never get to see female strength as it actually exists, like out in the real world, like deployed and like almost not quite like fetishized, but sort of like valorized on screen. And it's one of those things where it's just like a very tiny nuance, but the fact that like Patty Jenkins recognized that that was like something that was important to show, and then that a lot of like female viewers picked up on it, like I think that is like a example I always keep going back to about like how a female critic or just like a regular female audience member might be able to discern something based on lived experience that like a man might not, because it's quite possible that like men are so sort of like used to media images of what like female physical strength looks like, that like they might not recognize that like what they see as an image is not actually correlated to reality. Anyway, that is my example.
I should note we're just hitting the 30-minute mark. This is a short panel. It's just 15 minutes. We're going to try to take a few minutes at the end for questions. If people have questions, you can put them in comments. They'll be moderated and they'll be passed to us by moderators. But that's where you want to put them if you want to ask us anything. The Wonder Woman movies are an excellent example. There were a lot of people pointing out the difference between how Patty Jenkins shoots women, and Wonder Woman in particular, versus how Zack Snyder shot women, particularly with his love of the upskirt shot. There's an awful lot of upskirt shot of Wonder Woman, specifically in Justice League. So we're all kind of familiar with the idea of the male gaze in film, of doing exactly that kind of thing, like zooming in on body parts and shooting with kind of a lascivious gaze. And we're just starting to talk about the female gaze in film coming from directors. I'm curious if you guys think there's a female gaze for film critics, for women film critics in general, and what it looks like.
I would say yes and no. Like, for instance, I mean, a movie that I think I had a very different reaction to was like Pieces of a Woman. That movie just did not work for me. I just kept saying it was like she lost a baby. And I'm like, they lost a baby. And I've gone through that. You know what I mean? And I am like, yes, every couple deals with it differently. But I'm like, you went through this traumatic thing and you're not leaning to the one person that understands what you witnessed. You're talking to everybody but the one person, and you're making decisions about things without including or even giving that one person the courtesy. I understand that people grow apart, and this sometimes can grow people apart, but I was really astonished that people kept saying, oh, this is great. And then I'm like, no, you don't. This is something that happens to two people. And I understand men and women process things differently. It is not something that goes away within 6 months or even years sometimes. And it takes a tremendous amount as a couple to process this. You know what I mean? And there's guilt and there's things. And I'm like, none of that was present. And allegedly, the people who made that film, it was their story. And I go, so you all just had this kid and she did her thing and you did this thing and you two never had a conversation about it? That is crazy to me. Even if it was an argument, it just did not work for me. And I was just like, I felt like I was like the only one that was having this conversation.
Yeah, that can be awkward when you feel like you're having a conversation with a film that nobody else is, or when you feel like the film is having a conversation that maybe it should be happening.
In that movie, you know, where you have that whole thing where suddenly this person that you're watching, we've heard some things about how he reacts to women. So that opens up that whole other separating the art from the artist question. But I couldn't watch that movie without thinking about that. which was, you try to divorce that. You try to shut that off. But you just made me think about it with Pieces of a Woman. So sorry. That's not exactly what your question was about, but
I think that I mean, like, initially I took Tasha's question very literally, and I was like, is there like a horny female gaze? But I think that the more I think about it, the more, especially like when we're talking about how a lot of male directors, straight male directors shoot women, I think that something I have begun thinking a lot about is how much the camera sort of like trains you to look at the world, and how much so much of like my gaze, if it can be called that, is sort of like trying to divorce like what has been sort of like imposed upon me about like how I should see the world versus like how I actually want to see the world. And so I think something like the upskirt thing is sort of like a really good example of like Zack Snyder giving you sort of like maybe like titillation, maybe permission to sort of like look at the world in like this particular way. And then me going in as like someone who is not always like the intended viewer, and feeling that dissonance of like, I understand like what this perspective is, and I also do not share this perspective. And so trying to both sympathize with like that perspective and try to like understand where it's coming from and like why it's doing a thing that it's doing, versus like my own reaction to, versus like me trying to figure out like how I would frame this, for example. Because I think one of the things like as I get older that I think a lot about is sort of how much I resent like male narratives or male points of view that have been like imposed upon me just as like a person living in the world consuming culture. And so I guess my idea of like the female gaze is just sort of like that double vision of like seeing what is like being taught to me, and then me trying to figure out like what I should figure out for myself.
I feel that for me, I really saw that with P-Valley this summer that came out on Stars, and just how that was shot by all women every episode. It's based in a strip club. A lot of times the women are nude, mostly nude, but you don't think about that. You're thinking about the story because when they're dancing, it's shot so beautifully. There are no close-ups. You're, thinking about, one of the girls running from her past and another one who's trying to open up her own business. So I think it strips away. It says, yes, these women exist. There are sex workers, but they're not, their jobs, or they are not just bodies. They're people, and they're really fully fleshed out. And I really, really love that show as a result. And it's just what Inkoo said. It's like you're constantly thinking, you don't know, like when you're a little girl or you're watching these like teen flicks or whatever, that things are overly sexualized. There's a lot of unlearning I think women have had to do. So where you can just enjoy and you don't feel, angry or uncomfortable. I think there's also a lot of like self-shaming that women do around sexuality and a lot of different things that we're taught that isn't necessarily accurate, and things like this. And I think even the generation behind me is really opening our eyes without, being angry or shameful about certain things. So I think that's really important as well.
I just want to add to something that Aramide was saying, that because if I think of like the stripper scenes in P-Valley and contrast them to something like a really easy comparison to something like The Sopranos, where like in The Sopranos, the strippers sort of take on the same role that they would for the male characters, where they're just like background, like entertainment. They're completely dehumanized. I think like the most like humanized that like one of the strippers get is like when they have like their head bashed in or something. So like basically they're sort of like sex objects, or sort of like nameless victim, essentially, right? And I think the really amazing thing about P-Valley and the way that show shoots the strip teases is that it's so much about sort of like the physical labor of stripping and the athleticism of it. And Aramide said something really wonderful about like unlearning, and like that show is a show that figured out how to like unlearn like our received images of strippers and figured out its like own thing of like what it wants to present to the world. Even if you compare it to something like Hustlers, which also sort of has this like gauzy romanticism about about stripping. I think probably because it's made by like a middle class like white woman who still like sort of like other these strippers, even though I love that movie. Like P-Valley is a movie that really tries to force the audience to see stripping in a completely new way through its camera, and just sort of like see it as something completely like artful and yet economic and yet athletic, and just the way that like it figured out its own language, its own visual language about stripping, I think is like a really wonderful example of something that like is happening out in the culture.
I think the other thing I love about that show is the women it celebrates them having real bodies. Do you know what I mean? It's like they don't have fake boobs and fake bottoms. They have real bodies that have stretch marks and all of those things. Because I think when you talk about unlearning, we as women sometimes think, not all of us, that men, what they look for in us, you know, I mean, I know if girlfriends have been in relationships and with someone and they've been intimate and their partner has never seen their body because they're afraid that they'll find out that their boobs aren't up to here and that their thighs are a little bit wrinkled. And I think all of those things are things that we think of, like when you show such things as strippers, that they have to be perfect, because in our minds, that's all the imaging we've ever seen. Everybody that works in a strip club has perfect boobs, has a perfect butt, legs, everything is perfect. And these women are sexy, but they're not perfect. And men don't necessarily want that. You know, they want sexy and confidence. And it's like she said, I mean, the routine is so, like, you look at it and you're like, holy crap. I mean, the things you got to do to get like $20 or to get them to election, I'm exhausted, right? So you start not thinking about just like that these women are naked or near naked. You're just like, that's a lot of stuff you got to put up with. And also the fact that you have to be on guard to understand what type of guy that you're engaging with. Like, is it going to be safe? If I go back there, is this guy going to try to, not pay me for a service? All of those different skill sets that you don't necessarily think about. But again, I think the thing that I love, again, the most is these women are very comfortable in their bodies and that their bodies are not perfect. And I hope more of us women look at ourselves and not think, in order for me to be sexy, in order for me to be attractive, I have to have, Dr. Miami work on me, and then I could be out there in the world,
And they have the idea that they have more agency too, and they have more depth to them. They're not just bodies. I mean, when you mentioned Sopranos and I was thinking there's a whole slew of movies that you would go, any movie that involves somewhat of a shady character, they always go to a strip club. There's always, naked women in the background, and they're always relegated to the background. They're not there for any reason other than like decoration. And if we could count how many movies there are that have that, I mean, if I had $1 for each one, I'd be very wealthy. It's just, why? And I would like to think that men maybe are rethinking that about, just this backdrop, like wallpaper of, the strip club women. And it's all about, people actually having a story and having some depth.
There are times when I wonder if the immense prevalence of sequences shot in strip clubs, in unrelated movies, in police procedurals, in crime dramas, is just because the director wanted to get into a strip club and work with naked women for 6 days or whatever. But speaking of that feeling of being careful who you interact with, of being concerned about just who you're speaking to, a thing that we hear a lot from women critics is that they get pushed back just for being women. There is a thread of people who are just angry all the time at women's having the nerve to speak up and have opinions, especially opinions that disagree with theirs. Has everybody here, I'm kind of assuming just because you're women in this field, have you all dealt with some kind of, harassment that felt specifically gendered?
Oh, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I used to write about music, so I wrote about hip hop. So this is so nice and calming, I was like, I have not had any death threats, you know what I mean? And just, being like, okay, where are all the exits? And my photographer that I used to work with used to be a big guy. Like, he was a big, solid guy, sweetest guy in the world. But I was like, good. So everybody's going to think like he's like my security or whatever. But it was just, you know, I really had to learn, and I was much younger, and I had to learn to be like, okay. And I didn't get the support, you know. I mean, I had editors who would tell me, like, you're earning, you know, somebody popped your cherry. Okay, good. You got a death threat. So what? We get them all the time. You know, you want all the things that we men have. There you go. But I'm like, nobody, you know, threatened to rape you and cut your head off. It's a little different in that type of way. You know what I mean? Or just being able to, I remember, you know, there was when Dee Barnes, when that happened with her and Dr. Dre, and a lot of us advocating to editors and saying, we want to write about this. Oh, no, no, no. We're going to lose our access. You crazy? We'll never get Interscope to give us any more things. These were the conversations. And I'm like, but a woman was attacked. She's in the hospital, and you're going to pretend it never happened. And this is how you have these things where, you know, where you have men getting away with things, you know what I mean? And people say, well, why didn't anybody tell the story 20 years ago? No, it wasn't that no one wanted to tell the story. We didn't have the support to tell it. And we didn't have the option to self-publish or to say, okay, I work for this outlet. I can go now to this outlet and tell the story, because you would lose your job. So that definitely has gotten better. But I would like to see more support when women say, this is an important story. You don't have to get it, but trust me, we need to tell it. Trust me on this and let me tell it.
I've definitely gotten a lot of online abuse, and specifically sexual assault threats, and for some reason. And for me specifically, I get it when I write about certain topics. I recently published a piece regarding Ta-Nehisi Coates' new Superman, and my mentions on Twitter are in shambles right now, like in absolute shambles. And I think, you know, for me, I've kind of, Twitter is different, but people will find your email address, your personal email address. Facebook luckily filters out a lot of gunk as well, but people will find you and they will come for you. And I've gotten used to it. And luckily there are avenues now to report to editors, but at the end of the day, these are nameless, faceless people mostly on the internet. But it is always around like a Marvel or a DC or something they feel I shouldn't be tipping my toe in, or I don't know anything about. So that's what it's never about me writing something about Miss Juneteenth. It's always something very male centric.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the comic book geeks. Those are the ones, when I was at USA Today, they were the ones that always came after me. They're like, you never like any, you know, no, that's not true. I have liked, you know, some comic book movies, or I actually got a death threat once though, but that was more because I liked it was Fahrenheit 9/11, and the person was threatening to kill Michael Moore and me. So, and I figured they'll find him before they'll find me, so I better let the lawyers know. But yeah, I mean, over a movie, a death threat, it just seems so ridiculous. But yeah, I mean, that used to happen all the time at USA Today when I was constantly being trolled, and I was like the lead critic, and I was a woman, and then they would say things, you must have slept with your boss, how'd you get this job? And, you know, it just felt so like old school. It was so ridiculous. Whatever.
It's truly wild how some men just cannot handle an opinion that is different from theirs.
Piers
That's
Morgan.
it. I mean, like, I feel like I go on Twitter and I encounter literally hundreds of opinions I disagree with every single day. Am I sending any of those people death threats? No. I think there's also something here about just sort of the way that fandom has gotten really possessive, and corporations really encourage, for, I think, their customers, for good reason on their part, to sort of look at all of these cultural products as extensions of their identity. So I guess they feel like if you don't like the same movie that they like, it's something like really like on like them as a person, as opposed to like people having different opinions. And I don't know, I guess like if we're on the subject of like unlearning, I think that kind of like toxic fandom is probably something that we need to figure out how to unlearn for a lot of people. Easier said than done.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I certainly didn't want to head out on like a sad or toxic or negative note. I think one thing we can maybe all agree right now is that the space is changing, that we're seeing more and more women take up criticism, as we're seeing more and more women take up film and TV production. Again, direction, writing, starring, stories about women, stories about people of color, stories about communities that were never addressed before, and cultures that were never addressed before. So we're at time. As we move to wrap, any last positive thoughts? Anything that you're just particularly happy to see happening in the world of female film criticism now?
I would say the camaraderie. Like, I met Aramide at Sundance, and so we see each other at these things. So you sit together, you catch your Uber together, you'll grab some food together. So you know that even if you, let's say you fly in by yourself, you're not going to be by yourself. You have this group of women that you've built community with. So I always encourage women, no matter what age are, I've met my film festival buddy on Twitter. Wasn't crazy, and she's now one of my closest friends, and we do the festival circuit together. So I encourage women to use social media to bond and to meet and to connect and to have fellowship, because again, it's nice to know, like, even let's say you go somewhere by yourself, oh, I can have dinner with so-and-so, or her and I can, if it's expensive, we can share a hotel room or whatever it is. So that is one thing I think, from women that have been doing this a lot longer than me, they didn't always have. It would be like one woman and them, you know what I mean? And it was kind of like the boys would do their thing, and you were like, oh, do you need someone to have dinner with? Oh, well, but we're going to do this. So in that way, I think it's gotten better. We're willing to help, I think, share resources. Hey, this is going here. This is here. This is how you take the bus. And that is encouraging.
And I think more young people really are. I go to so many different things, and young people, and they're young women of color, like 9 times out of 10 coming up and asking and wanting to go into this. And I'm always like, I'm happy to be a mentor. Contact me, send me whatever. I just think it's really important to encourage people to more women to go into the field. And I mean, I remember being the only woman in the room, and I think that's happening a whole lot less. So I'm really happy to see that.
Some of my best friends are white women, but I'm really glad that there is like a lot more differentiation between white women and women of color. I think that differentiation between straight and queer women also really important. Yeah, I feel like the conversation has changed a lot since sort of like, where are the women critics sort of conversations that we were having, I don't know, even like 5 years ago, when Meryl Streep was like, I looked on Rotten Tomatoes, and like, I'm glad that like women critics are being treated less as like a monolith. And I think that's something that's really important to me. I would guess really important to everyone on this panel. And so that has been nice to see.
Definitely. I'm really pleased with sort of the wealth of avenues that we're able to talk about films and things like that. When I first started, it felt very much like a competition, especially among Black women, because there's so few of us in this field, and it still can feel that way because we're now, getting a slew of things on Netflix and a slew of things on Hulu and Amazon and everything else. There's room for more voices. And I'm also pleased that it seems that outlets are no longer just reaching out to us during Black History Month or Women's History Month. So that's also much nicer. I'm not writing for one outlet like a couple of times a year. It's more consistent than that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all both for participating in this panel and just for your contributions to film criticism. I mean, I personally think that the more voices we get out there, the better. The more people speaking up, the more perspectives we have, just the better it is for everybody. So I'm so glad to see you all here, and I'm so glad to see you all out in the field. Thank you.
Thank you for your great moderation. You asked good questions.
Thank you for having us. This was fun.
Yeah.